Hello, and welcome to another episode of AppSec Decoded. I'm Taylor Armerding, security advocate for the Synopsys Software Integrity Group, and today we're talking about embedding security into DevOps. Building security into the software development lifecycle has been a mantra for years within the Synopsys Software Integrity Group. But with DevOps becoming mainstream and with the speed of development increasing by orders of magnitude, that's a more complicated and challenging task than even a few years ago. The reality is that in modern software development, the pressure for speed trumps just about everything. So today, the task for security teams is not simply to build security into the SDLC, but to build it into DevOps, which then makes it DevSecOps. Our guest expert today is Natasha Gupta, Security Solutions Manager for Integrated Application Security at Synopsys, which includes Synopsys Code DX and Intelligent Orchestration. She has more than 8 years of experience in the cybersecurity and enterprise networking space. And prior to Synopsys, Natasha managed product marketing initiatives for ServiceNow Security Operations, a SOAR, S-O-A-R, platform for incident and vulnerability management. She has also held various roles in product marketing and software product management at Imperva and A10 Networks. Natasha, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so we'll plunge right in. How has modern software development introduced new challenges to security and risk management?
Yeah, I think, Taylor, you have summarized a lot of the existing paradigm that we see with the security and risk challenge that exists and coexists with the way that modern software development has really changed the nature of two different problems. One is the speed aspect. The fact that modern software development, particularly in the context of a lot of the core technologies to implementing DevOps, when we look at low latency, nimble architectures like serverless architectures, leveraging microservices, whether we look at the components of software and how heavily it utilizes open source code, there are multiple opportunities when we talk about the speed aspect of modern software development, where there are mechanisms to quickly deploy software to production, and there's an intent to increase speed by using those various mechanisms. And therefore, unchecked vulnerabilities have an easier time making it to production level code. And in fact, there is a recent study that we put out with our ESG report that basically highlights that many developers, as many as 30 to 80% of organizations today, they are wrapping their heads around this issue of production level code containing known vulnerabilities. And that is to keep up with that essential need for speed in modern software development. And there's also a second half of that problem, which is what is the scale of that security and risk management issue? When we think of all of the components of application development as it's done today and the number of applications that can contain software weaknesses, that's just not limited to custom-built applications. In large enterprises, there are hundreds of applications. They are depending on whether we're talking about infrastructure code, whether we're talking about commercial code, contracted code. And all of these various interrelated applications, each can have some type of vulnerability, some type of weakness that could go unchecked. And when we talk about the visibility aspect of capturing, what does that risk footprint look like? Now, that's a tremendous application security question that enterprises today have a lot of blind spots in that they use many, many tools to try and get their arms around that source of the truth. But each of those tools could present their own proprietary assessment of what is the scope of that weakness? What is the severity of it? What is the business criticality of the software that it affects? And when you're wading through that patchwork of various assessments of risk, that across the scale that we just talked about, where a large enterprise like Amazon, for instance, is deploying software to production every second reportedly. That is a tremendous level of scalability and that you need in that level of visibility that you pay to security and risk, and a very complex question to wrap your arms around if you're an AppSec developer today.
Obviously, not every DevSecOps initiative is perfect yet, or maybe never. But if there are problems, why do you think DevSecOps initiatives either stall or just fail outright?
Well, as we talked about the first issue with enormous amount of information overload and the type of scale that we touched on in your first question as well, that there is not only many sources of that software weakness and the potential flaws in this process that slip through the cracks, but the detection and the triage aspect of this is very complex with what we noted with the numerous amount of data silos that occur with multiple tools. So a typical AppSec developer is potentially taking a lot of this data and maybe importing it into a manual spreadsheet to track, a custom data lake to track this. Mm-hmm. And that creates one layer of inefficiency. You also have pipeline congestion. When you're running a lot of these different kinds of tests and you don't maybe have a uniform methodology for doing that testing, you're testing at random, you're testing at various points where you may not need to even test, it can congest pipelines, it can break builds, and it can possibly introduce another layer of latency to the process. And many teams at that point, for fulfilling the SLAs, for the need for speed that we talked about earlier, often forgo that very necessary security testing because they can't wrap around their arms around that process. But one very critical part of this that also is a huge part of DevSecOps that we often talk about, not just process, not just technologies, but also people and an overall culture, is that what these tools often fall short of being able to do is bridging that security understanding and that level of context between various important stakeholders in this process. They are often still unable to answer the questions: what was fixed? What was found? What is the level of my exposure and exploitability? And most importantly, for a lot of these developers who are the most responsible for remediation of those vulnerabilities, how do I commit that fix? How do I fix it? And what is the scope of the change that is required? And the lack of that level of remediation guidance is often why on many surveys we've seen an answer that I know that I am vulnerable, but I don't know how to fix it. And so many production level code vulnerabilities are often known actually early on in the software development and production process, and they simply go unmitigated because of that lack of instilling of a security culture in the tooling.
After noting that not all DevSecOps initiatives are successful, what would you recommend that organizations need to do to change for those campaigns to succeed?
Well, I think that there are three principles that are very valuable to keep in mind for mitigating a lot of these problems and these pain points that we talked about. Right. The first is being able to secure code as fast as you write it. And what that really means is as much as you can shift your tooling, your ability to proactively check for security vulnerabilities and weaknesses at shifting that testing downstream and making your tooling that you adopt something lightweight that can be integrated in the IDE. Mm-hmm. That is a very important part of taking the proactive approach to testing. The second is when you look at testing workflows at large, are you critically conducting the right testing at the right time? Right. And what that really boils down to is taking a survey of what is the application I'm testing in terms of its level of business criticality, balancing that with the type of testing that is required, that accounts for the level of code change, that accounts for the specific stage of the SDLC that you want to test that issue for. But also, what are the conditions that merit triggering testing? Was it a minor code change? Was it simply a cosmetic change to, let's say, the font, or was it something more intrinsic to the scope of feature functionality, or are there dependencies with other applications that interact with that, or different features that interact with that? So that's very important when you talk about right testing at the right time and putting some thought into testing meaningfully. But perhaps the most important principle, and the third principle that makes all of these activities matter most, is being able to filter AppSec noise and focus all of that data that you're collecting from testing intelligently and from doing your testing in a way that is efficient and that is integrated in a proactive way. To make that meaningful, you have to be able to take that data and focus on what matters most. And that relies on having a single AppSec system of record, which is so core to resolving a lot of what we have been touching on with the lack of a security culture and clarity, the scaling problem, and that amount of data and investment that comes from a lot of AST tooling.
Thanks very much. We're going to leave it there. Thanks to Natasha Gupta for helping us understand that speed and security are not mutually exclusive. You've been watching AppSec Decoded. I'm Taylor Armerding. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.